My wife and I bought this clock about 20 years ago from Myers House of Clocks in Tacoma, Washington. And when we bought it, Mr. Meyer said that this is a pretty good clock. It'll run about 20 years, and then you'll have to buy a new one. So you can see here that it's stopped working, and I think what it needs is just to be cleaned out. So I'm going to do that today. I'm going to take apart this clock, see if I can clean all the dirt off of the gears, and get it running again. Now it's important that you take out the pendulum before you move the clock so we don't damage anything. And I have this clock, there's a screw at the top but also a screw at the bottom so that when I open the door to wind it, it doesn't change the position of the clock on the wall, because that seems to change how fast or slow it runs. So we have it secured both at the top and the bottom. So here I'm going to take out the clock mechanism out of the box, and the chimes will stay in the box because the chimes are separate and it's just the hammers that strike them, but that can be removed separately. So first thing for taking apart this clock mechanism is removing the hands, and the minute hand has a little thumb wheel that you screw off, but the hour hand you just have to twist it until it comes off. Now, I've never taken apart this clock before, so I was just kind of trying, but I knew that ring probably had to come off, and then I think there's probably fasteners underneath the clock face, but I don't actually know. And it turns out that they stuck the clock face on to the clock with double-sided tape, which you just heard me pop off. And then it turns out there are fasteners, 4 of them, and so I just pop those off, and off comes that wooden thing. Now, when you're doing a project like this, you need to be really organized as to where you put the gears and such, because you need to be able to put this thing all back together in the same way that it came apart. And there's a lot of pieces that look kind of similar. So make for sure you set up certain areas of your workspace to contain the various parts of the clock. And right here I am unwinding the springs. There's a lot of tension in those springs, and so the first thing to do is to remove that tension, because I don't want it to destroy the clock mechanism. If I were to pop out a rod without releasing the tension, that'd be really bad. And I don't want one of those things exploding and shredding me, because it's a really tight wound spring. So I've released the tension on all of the springs, and there's 3 sections to this clock. There is the middle section, which is the actual timekeeping. There is the hour chime section, and then there's the quarter hour chime section. So here I'm taking off the chime hammers, and it turns out I couldn't just unscrew some screws, I had to disconnect some other stuff also. So that rod is part of the hour chime, and it actually pulls back and causes 3 hammers to strike the chimes all at the same time. And that's what gets you the hour going. And then that thing just rotates out and slides off. And it's important that that goes back in the same way that it came off, because otherwise your chimes would be messed up. And here I'm taking off the pendulum, or it's actually the pendulum hanger. I have to say, I wasn't really looking forward to doing this job. This is a complicated mechanism. It's got a lot of pieces that are all relatively fragile, and they all have to be put back in the same spot as where they came off. So it's fairly detailed work, but it was either that or buy a new one, and there's something to be said for fixing old stuff, and this I really don't think even needs to be fixed. I think it just needs to be cleaned. And that's the mechanism that goes tick-tock. That snap ring actually just flew off, and I didn't see where it went, so I had to look around for it, but I did find it. So be careful when you're removing snap rings, because they can go flying. And so I was a lot more careful when I was removing all the rest of them. And these are the snap rings for the rods that go into the springs. Now here I'm just taking off the 4 nuts that hold the back plate on, and it turns out you don't want to force this. It turns out there was a nut on the other side on the front face of the clock that I needed to remove as well, that I didn't know about. So make for sure not to force anything when you're doing a project like this. And there's the nut I need to take off on the front side. And it turns out that there are some chiming mechanisms in the way, and so they have to be removed first. And they are also held on with snap rings, smaller ones from the spring rod snap rings. And they kind of stack up in such a way that they have to be taken off in a certain order. And they also have to be put back on in a certain order. One other thing, I actually took a lot of pictures of this clock mechanism before I started taking it apart, so that I could use those pictures when I was trying to put it back together to get it back in the same order and have all the gears line up in the same spot. It turns out those pictures are really important. So there's that nut. While I was taking it off, I actually put the other 4 nuts on the back on so that I can manipulate the clock without it falling apart. and they're just hand tight. And then the back plate comes off, and we can see that here, and that exposes all your gears. And that's the hour, that's the time, and that's the quarter hour chimes. So those are the three mechanisms. And then what I do to make sure I can put this thing back together in the same spot is I scratch with a razor blade on the big gear where it meets the little gear, so that I will be able to put this clock back together in exactly the same spot where I took it apart. And it turns out that's only important on the chiming mechanisms. On the time, it doesn't really matter if you're able to put that back in the same spot. But for the chiming, it's critically important. So make for sure you mark the gears in some way that you'll be able to tell how to put it back together. Basically with the gears being in the same spot. And this is one of the gears, and they basically all look like this with this black crud on there. And so you got to scrape it off, and that's what it looks like, and it's kind of dirty, gets everything black that you touch with it. And that's what a gear looks like when it's clean. And when you go to reassemble it, so this is some clock grease, and you only put that on the gears that are right next to the springs because they turn slow enough that they need grease. On all other gear axles, you put oil. You don't actually put grease on the gears or oil on the gears themselves. You only put it on the axles. So here I'm greasing the gear axle holes for the gears that interface directly with the springs. And you have to grease both plates of the clock mechanism. And this is after I've cleaned the plate out, because you don't want any dirt in the axle holes. So, and what I use to clean those out is a toothpick that I sharpen the end of. And you just spin the toothpick in the hole until it comes out clean. So I've cleaned all the gears, I've got them all back in the same spot that they were, and this part's a little tricky because the gears, you have to line up each gear axle so that it fits in the right hole in the back plate. And don't force anything. This is critically important that you not bend any of those axles. And so you just need to move slow, and that's what I'm doing here. And so you have to check each axle, and as the plate gets further down, you'll run into another axle that's not in its hole. And so you can pop each one into their own hole. And for some of this I'm using a little rod. And I actually got it down, and so now you screw those screws on. And here I'm going to oil the axles, and they have a little well in the back plate and in the front plate that will hold the oil. And so you just dip the toothpick in the oil, and then you touch it to the well, and it will fill up the oil well. And you want just a little bit, not too much. You don't want this thing dripping in oil. So here I'm oiling the front side as well. And there were some gears that I wasn't actually able to take out. They have plates that are pressed on, and so I just tried to get them as clean as I could. And then you have to reach back behind the plate or a gear with a toothpick and oil those axles too. And here I'm reassembling that nut on the front plate. And then I'm looking at pictures here that I took beforehand to make for sure I can get this back together in the right way. Like I said, those pictures at the beginning are really important. And these two levers that I'm putting on, these are part of the hour chime. And so it's an interesting mechanism that makes it chime the right number of gongs for the right hour. So those parts are all in place. And here I'm putting those snap rings on, and then I'm getting the springs put in with their rods to keep them in place. And we don't need to wind anything yet. And then back to these tricky snap rings for the spring rods. So here I'm winding it, and then I'm testing out, does the mechanism still work? And it turns out that it did. And so now I'm putting in the pendulum holder. And then you have to align this a little bit. And so I kept doing that until I could get the thing to run. And then I oiled that axle as well. And here we can see it's running. Alright, and then I just put it back in the box, and I put the faceplate on and the ring. So here it turns out when I got it started and I was trying to time it, so you have to get the pendulum so that it goes tick tock, and those are evenly spaced out. The ticks and tocks are spaced out. While I was doing that, it started chiming, and it chimed on the half hour, and so I'm putting the minute hand back in the right spot. It turns out the hour hand can be rotated freely, but the minute hand, it has to go on the quarter hour, because it's actually got a square hole and a square peg. And here I'm tightening that up. Now the pendulum also can be adjusted, and there's a thumb wheel at the bottom that can move the pendulum weight up and down to speed the clock up or slow it down. And I assume that that is correct, since this clock was keeping time before it stopped working. So I'm not going to adjust that right now. The best way that I've found to time this thing is to put a microphone inside the clock mechanism and then use my iPhone, and you set it to voice recorder, and then as you're recording it, you can see the waveform that shows up as it's recording. So the way you do this is you swing the pendulum all the way to one direction, and then you incrementally move it farther and farther in the other direction, and then you check to see is the timing correct. So here I'm moving it to the right and then letting it tick, and we can see that it's not timed correctly because it's not a 50% between the tick and the talk. So here I'm moving it a little more, and it helps to have a card, an index card back there, so you can see how far you're moving it. And you can still see that I haven't timed it correctly, and so I'm moving it just a little more, and you have to make small adjustments, otherwise you'll overshoot and you'll have it tick-tock the other way. And here you can see it's pretty close to 50%, and that's good enough for me. And that's how you take apart a wall clock, clean all the gears, put it back together and time it. And this clock has been running since I did that. It's been running about 2 weeks now, and I think it'll probably run for another 20 years. Hey, do you like these videos? Subscribe. I'll make more. Bye.